The coffee had long gone cold, its bitter dregs a dark mirror in the bottom of a stained ceramic mug. Leo didn't mind. At 2:17 a.m., warmth was a luxury, but caffeine was a necessity. He ran a hand over his tired face, the red glow of the on-air light painting deep canyons in the lines of his palm. Outside the massive soundproof window of the broadcast booth, the world was a uniform, featureless black. This was K-Wolf. 98.7 FM, the Howl of the High Pines. Or, as Leo privately called it, the tin can at the end of the world. The station was a small, concrete bunker dropped in the middle of 100,000 acres of whispering pine and sleeping mountain. The nearest town, Pine Creek, was a 40-mile drive down a winding, lit road, a journey he made only twice a week for groceries and a fleeting dose of human contact. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping into the smooth, intimate baritone he reserved for the lonely hours. And that was Harvest Moon from Neil Young, a classic for a clear Tuesday night. Or I suppose a clear Wednesday morning. For the three of us still awake out there, the cosmos is putting on a bit of a show tonight. The Perseids are peaking, so if you've got a clear view, away from the city lights, well, you're in the right place for that, aren't you? Keep your eyes on the heavens. He smiled to himself. His audience was a motley collection of the sleepless, long-haul truckers rumbling through the mountain passes, third-shift workers at the distant lumber mill, insomniacs, and dreamers. He was their shepherd, his voice a steady beacon in the vast, silent ocean of the night. He found a deep, abiding comfort in it. Out here he was in control. The world was reduced to what he could channel through his console, a mix of soft rock, classic folk, and his own calming narration. It was a predictable, ordered universe of his own making. With a practiced motion, he queued up the next track, a long, atmospheric piece by a band no one had heard of. The song's gentle, instrumental build would give him a solid 7-minute break. He pushed his chair back, the wheels groaning softly, and stretched until his spine popped. The only other sounds were the quiet hum of the broadcast equipment and the whisper of the ventilation system. A constant mechanical breath. This was his sanctuary. In the city, life was a chaotic mess of noise, expectation, and traffic. Out here, there was only the signal going out clean and strong from the massive, red-blinking transmission tower that loomed over the station like a skeletal sentinel. Nothing else got in, no cell service to speak of, and the station's internet was a laughably slow satellite link that barely handled email on a good day. It was an island of analog technology in a digital world, and that suited Leo just fine. He walked over to the great window that made up the front wall of the booth, the so-called fishbowl. The station's exterior floodlights pushed back the darkness for about 50 feet, illuminating a patch of gravel, the start of the dense pine forest, and the chain-link fence that marked the station's perimeter. Beyond that, the darkness was absolute, a solid thing that seemed to press against the light, waiting for it to fail. He'd seen bears snuffling at the edge of the light, herds of deer moving like ghosts, the occasional glint of a coyote's eyes. He felt less like he was looking out and more like he was on display, a single, warm-blooded creature in a glass box. Tonight, however, there was nothing. Just the trees motionless in the still air. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was thick and cold, designed to withstand a rogue branch in a winter storm or the curiosity of a black bear. It made him feel safe, secure. As the first ethereal notes of the song began to fade in through his monitor speakers, a sharp, unexpected crackle of static burst in his headphones. It was loud enough to make him wince. Frowning, he spun back to the console. All the levels were green. The transmission signal was solid. The weather was clear. There was no reason for it. He chalked it up to some freak atmospheric interference, a common enough occurrence in the mountains. Still, it was unusually harsh. A jagged little tear in the smooth fabric of his broadcast. He made a note in the station log, 0224, AV anomaly, brief, high-intensity static burst. Cleared immediately. He stood there for a moment listening. The instrumental track continued its placid journey. The hum of the servers was unchanged. The red on-air light burned with steady indifference. All was as it should be. He shook his head, a small laugh escaping his lips. He was getting jumpy. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. It was just another long night at the tin can. the same as hundreds of nights before. He settled back into his chair, the deep, familiar comfort of the worn leather wrapping around him. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. A solitary king on his forgotten throne, blissfully unaware that the walls of his kingdom were about to be breached. The last gentle chords of the song faded into the hum of the console. Leo leaned forward, pressing the button to open his microphone channel. His lips parted to announce the next track, a routine series of muscle movements he'd performed thousands of times. The words never came out. Instead, the air was split by a sound that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was the opening tone of the emergency broadcast system, the three-part chord, the signature of a national alert. But it was wrong, horribly wrong. The first tone was pitched too high, a piercing shriek that made Leo rip the headphones from his ears. The second was a low, grinding growl like stressed metal. The final tone was a stuttering, corrupted warble that decayed into a hiss of static. On his main board, a series of red lights flashed in sequence. It was override initiated, all channels locked. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. This was standard procedure. When the EAS activates, it seizes control of the broadcast signal. He had no power to stop it. He was a passenger, but he'd been through countless weekly tests, the occasional severe weather alert, and one amber alert last spring. None of them had ever sounded like that. That was the sound of a system having a seizure. He stared at the speakers, his breath held tight in his chest. A wave of static washed through the booth, thick and oily. The standard message was supposed to follow, "This is a test of the emergency alert system," delivered by a calm, synthesized voice. But the voice that spoke from the speakers was not calm, and it was not synthesized. It was a chorus, 1,000 overlapping whispers, wet and chitinous like insects scrabbling over each other in a deep hive. It was a sound scraped from the bottom of a wet well, a sound that flayed the nerves. These myriad whispers coalesced, struggling against each other to form words to mimic human speech. The resulting voice was a guttural, layered thing, a grotesque parody of language. "It's not a test." The 6 words hung in the air, each syllable dripping with a chilling, resonant gravity. Leo's blood went cold. The one phrase you pray you never hear. His mind scrambled for an explanation. A hacker. It had to be a hacker with a sick sense of humor and a terrifying amount of skill. The new war of the worlds, the layered voice continued, the whispers seeming to grow in number and intensity. "Do not trust your eyes. The dark is listening." Leo instinctively glanced at the large window, at the impenetrable blackness beyond the station's lights. The words turned his sanctuary into a stage. He was being watched. The comforting solitude of his job curdled into a terrifying vulnerability. The darkness, his old silent companion, was now an active, malevolent presence. "They've learned the voices." This was the phrase that broke him. The sheer existential horror of it. It wasn't just a warning about a physical threat. It was a psychological one. An enemy that could mimic, that could use the voices of loved ones, that could turn the very concept of communication into a weapon. His mind flashed with a primal fear. The terror of the cuckoo in the nest, the changeling in the crib. Stay out of the open. Close every door. It was a direct command. Final, desperate piece of advice from an impossible source. As the last word was spoken, the broadcast didn't simply end. It was torn apart. A sound like shearing metal and a wet biological shriek ripped through the speakers. And then, silence. Absolute, profound, deafening silence. The on-air light was still glowing its blood-red hue. He was broadcasting nothing. Dead air, the cardinal sin of radio. But he couldn't move. His hands were gripping the edge of the console, his knuckles white. A cold sweat trickled down his spine. His heart was a frantic drum against the sudden oppressive quiet. He sat there for a full minute, maybe more. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the booth. He slowly, shakily put his headphones back on. He expected to hear the faint hiss of the carrier wave, the sound of an open and empty channel. But there was nothing, not even static. It was a dead, flat void. He looked at his console again. The EAS override lights were off. The system had released his board. He was back in control. But control of what? His gaze drifted back to the window, to the silent watching trees, to the darkness that had been given a name and a voice. It was no longer empty. It was listening. The silence that followed the broadcast was a physical weight. It pressed in on Leo, filled his ears, and seemed to suck the very air from the booth. For a long moment, he was a statue carved from fear, his mind a frantic storm of static. Then instinct and years of training kicked in. Dead air is the enemy. With a shaking hand, he slammed a button on his console. It was a pre-recorded station ID followed by a block of commercials for a local hardware store and a 24-hour diner. The mundane, comforting sounds of normality. As the jingle for Pine Creek Tools filled the booth, Leo finally took a breath. Came out as a ragged gasp. "Okay, Leo, think," he whispered, his voice sounding thin and foreign. "Think, a prank, a hack." It was the only explanation that didn't involve him losing his mind. Some tech-savvy psycho had managed to hijack the EAS tones and splice in their own twisted audio file. It was elaborate, sick, and terrifyingly effective, but it was explainable. It had to be. His first move was to call his station manager, a perpetually tired man named Arthur who lived an hour away. Leo snatched the receiver of the station's landline, the cold plastic slick in his sweaty palm. He punched in the number. There was no dial tone, just a dead hollow silence. He slammed the receiver down and tried again. Nothing. He spun in his chair to the ancient desktop computer in the corner. The satellite internet was a joke on the best of days, but email was usually possible. He clicked the mouse, waking the screen. The connection icon in the corner of the screen, a small satellite dish, had a red X through it. Connection. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. The landline and the internet being down at the same time wasn't unheard of. A bad winter storm could do it. But the sky was perfectly clear tonight. Coincidence? Or was it part of the prank? Part of the isolation. He was cut off completely. No, not completely. His broadcast signal, the one powered by its own generator and amplified by the massive tower outside, was still live. He was still sending his voice out into the darkness. He was a lighthouse keeper whose own radio was broken, able to send a signal but receive nothing back. The block of commercials ended. He was on again. He took another deep, shuddering breath and faded his microphone back in, forcing his voice into a semblance of its usual calm. "And we are back, K-Wolf, 98.7 on a Wednesday morning. Apologies for that, folks. We seem to be experiencing some significant technical difficulties with our emergency alert system. A real ghost in the machine tonight. Please disregard the previous message." Even to his own ears, he sounded unconvinced. His voice a thin veneer over a core of panic. He put on another song, a long one, and sagged back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. His heart was still doing a frantic trip hammer against his ribs. He felt a desperate need for confirmation, for someone else to tell him they'd heard it too, that it was just a stupid, elaborate hoax. That's when the call-in line began to blink. It was a separate phone system, a dedicated line for on-air calls, and for some reason it was still working. He stared at the blinking light for a second, a wave of profound relief washing over him, followed immediately by a spike of dread. He jabbed the button. "K-Wolf, you're on the air. What's on your mind tonight?" "Yeah, hey Leo." The voice was young, male, and tinny through the speaker. You okay, man? That was the weirdest thing I've ever heard. That wasn't a test, was it? Just a system malfunction, caller. Some crossed wires somewhere." Leo lied, the words tasting like ash. "Nothing to worry about." "If you say so," the caller said, unconvinced. "Sounded pretty freaky. Anyway, have a good night." The line clicked off. Leo exhaled. Okay, one person heard it. It was real. Now he just needed someone to confirm the prank. Another light blinked. He took the call. "Hey Leo, it's Jimmy the trucker." Leo recognized the name. Jimmy was a regular, a long-haul driver who often called in around 3 a.m. on his run through the mountains. "Hey Jimmy, everything all right on the road?" "That's just it, man. It's weird out here tonight. Real weird." After that thing on the radio, my headlights started flickering. Now they're just out, both of them. I'm pulled over on the shoulder up on Route 12, about 10 miles east of the gorge. "Probably just a fuse, Jimmy," Leo said, his own rationalization sounding increasingly flimsy. "Yeah, maybe. But there's something else. The trees, they don't look right. Leo felt a cold shiver trace a line down his spine. What do you mean they don't look right? I don't know how to explain it. Jimmy's voice was low, spooked. It's like they're too tall, and they're not swaying. There's no wind, but they should move a little, right? They're just still, like they're statues. It's creeping me out, man. Just gonna sit tight here in the cab till the sun comes up. Before Leo could respond, the line filled with a screech of static and went dead. Leo stared at the phone, his throat suddenly tight and dry. Do not trust your eyes. The grotesque voice from the broadcast echoed in his mind. The trees don't look right. It was just a spooked trucker on a dark road, his mind playing tricks on him after a weird broadcast. It had to be. Another light was blinking. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, his own voice hoarse. K-Wolf, did you see them? The voice was a frantic whisper. An older woman, by the old Miller place. Tall, so tall. The line cut out. The dread was no longer a knot in his stomach. It was a cold, rising tide, and it was about to drown him. Leo felt like he was breathing through a wet cloth. Each inhale was a struggle, thick and insufficient. He played another song, then another. His on-air commentary reduced to clipped, robotic announcements of the artist and title. His mind wasn't on the music. It was on a dark stretch of Route 12 where the trees stood like statues, and on a frantic, whispered voice cut off too soon. He was losing control, the carefully constructed reality of his show shattering like cheap glass. He had to get off the air. He had to shut the whole station down. But how? The emergency shutdown was a complex sequence, designed to prevent accidental dead air. It would take minutes, and a part of him, a terrified, irrational part, was screaming that silence was the worst possible thing right now. That his signal, however weak, was some kind of shield. The call-in light blinked again, a single insistent pulse of white light in the dim booth. He stared at it, his stomach twisting. He didn't want to answer. He wanted to rip the phone from the wall. But the light kept blinking, a desperate, silent plea. With a sense of grim finality, he pressed the button. The connection was awful, a storm of hissing static. He could barely hear a voice underneath it. K-Wolf, can you hear me? It was a woman, her voice a dry, urgent whisper, as if she were hiding, terrified of being overheard. I can hear you, Leo said, his own voice hushed. The connection is bad. Who is this? My name is Sarah, the woman whispered, the words crackling. You have to listen to me. I'm about 12 miles north of you, in the old cabin by the reservoir. The broadcast. It wasn't a prank. I'm starting to believe you, Leo breathed. No, you don't understand, she insisted, her whisper growing tight with panic. It wasn't a warning for us. It was a warning from them. An announcement. They're here. The signal, your radio tower. It's like a bonfire in the dark. It draws them. A cold dread, sharp and penetrating, pierced through Leo's fear. Draws who? What are you talking about? The old legends. People called them echoes, static devils. Things that live in the empty spaces, in the noise between signals. They don't have voices of their own. They have to borrow them. They've learned the voices. The monstrous chorus from the broadcast echoed in Leo's memory. My dog, Sarah whispered, and a sob caught in her throat. My dog Buster. He's been barking at the woods for an hour. A real frantic, terrified barking. But 5 minutes ago, he just stopped. He just went completely silent. Leo pictured the scene, a remote cabin, a loyal dog suddenly quiet. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the barking. And now, Sarah's voice dropped so low it was almost lost in the static. I can hear something outside. It's whispering my name, from the old well in the yard. Sarah. But it sounds wrong. Stretched out, hollow, like it learned the word from a worn-out tape. Leo gripped the console, his body rigid. This was it. This was real. A confirmation so chilling it froze the blood in his veins. He had to do something. Sarah, listen to me. Lock your doors. Barricade yourself in a room away from the windows. Call the police. A sound came through the line then. A dry, hopeless little laugh that was more terrifying than a scream. The phone line's dead. Has been since the broadcast. Yours is the only voice I can hear. A pause, and then her whisper was frantic again. Oh God, it's moving. It's coming toward the house. Stay on the line with me, Sarah. Leo said, his professional radio voice taking over for a second, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. "Keep talking to me. It's so tall," she whispered, her voice trembling violently now. "And thin, like a shadow that got stretched wrong. It's at the porch. Oh God, the dog. It's got the dog." Leo heard a sharp intake of breath, a muffled sob. Then a new sound came through the static, a faint rhythmic thump. Thump, thump. "Sarah, what is that sound?" "It's knocking," she breathed, her voice filled with a final breaking wave of terror. "But it's using Buster's head too." Her words were cut off by a sound that would haunt Leo for the rest of his life. It wasn't static. It was a sharp, wet cracking noise, followed by the sound of splintering wood. A choked gasp, Sarah's, and then the line went dead. Leo sat there, the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to the empty hiss. He didn't just lose the connection. He had heard the end of it. He had been a helpless witness to an atrocity, broadcast live to anyone who might be listening. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the receiver back in its cradle. The fear was still there, a raging inferno in his chest. But now it was mixed with something else, a cold, hard certainty. He was no longer just a victim of this thing. He was a participant. He slowly turned his chair to face the great glass window. He stared out into the oppressive, waiting darkness, his own reflection a pale, terrified ghost on the glass. The tin can was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and he was the bait. The dead air was an accusation. Leo sat frozen in his chair, the ghost of Sarah's final, choked gasp echoing in the silent booth. How long had he been sitting there? A minute? 10? Time had lost its familiar rhythm, stretching and compressing like a dying heartbeat. The song he'd put on had long since ended, leaving only the low hum of the machinery. He had to do something. Warn people. Shut down the signal that Sarah claimed was a beacon. But his thoughts were a panicked flock of birds scattering in every direction. Every option felt like a trap. If he went off the air, would that make things better or worse? Was the signal drawing them in? Or was it somehow keeping them at bay? A flicker of movement on one of his monitor screens snapped him out of his paralysis. He had 4 small black and white security camera feeds displayed on a screen to his left. Camera 3, aimed at the gravel driveway and the main gate, had registered something. He leaned closer, his eyes straining. The image quality was poor, grainy, and washed out by the powerful floodlights. He rewound the digital feed by 30 seconds. He watched, his breath catching in his throat. There, at the very edge of the light where the forest began, a shadow detached itself from the other shadows. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too slender. It moved with a twitching, unnatural gait, like a marionette with a few of its strings cut. It took 2 faltering steps into the illuminated area before retreating back into the darkness with a fluid speed that defied its jerky movements. It was exactly as Sarah had described it. A shadow stretched wrong. Leo's blood turned to ice water. It wasn't just on Route 12 or at a remote cabin by a reservoir. It was here, outside. He frantically switched between the camera feeds. Camera 1 showed the front door of the station. Empty. Camera 2, the rear maintenance entrance, empty. Camera 4 was aimed up at the base of the massive transmission tower. The camera was shaking slightly, and the image was distorted with waves of static, but there was nothing there. He switched back to camera 3. The driveway was empty again. Had he imagined it? Was his terrified mind, primed by Sarah's horrific call, now manufacturing monsters in the grainy footage? Scrape. The sound was loud, sharp, and directly above him. Metal on metal. He flinched, his head snapping up to the ceiling. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the station's corrugated steel roof. He thought of the heavy winter snows, the sound of ice sliding off. But the night was still and clear. Scrape, drag, thump. It was moving, systematically exploring. He was in a can and something was outside, trying to figure out how to open it. He backed his chair away from the console, pushing himself against the rear wall of the booth, trying to make himself smaller. His eyes were glued to the ceiling, listening to the slow, deliberate sounds of the thing on the roof. Then the scraping stopped. Silence descended again, thick and expectant. Leo held his breath, straining his ears, listening for the next sound, the next clue. Where was it now? The sound was soft, almost gentle, and it came from the window. Leo's head whipped around. He stared at the huge pane of soundproof glass in front of him. There was nothing there but his own wide-eyed, terrified reflection staring back. The gravel patch outside was empty, bathed in the sterile white light of the floodlights. Tap, tap. There it was again. Clearer this time. It was coming from the lower left corner of the window, a spot just at the edge of his vision. He forced himself to stay perfectly still, barely breathing. Was this a new tactic? A psychological game? Tap, 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 rhythmic this time, deliberate, a pattern, a request, an invitation. It was the sound of a single fingernail, or something like a fingernail, tapping patiently on the thick, cold glass. He knew with a certainty that defied all logic that if he moved his head even an inch to look directly at the source of the sound, he would see a long, thin finger, a dark hand, a shadowy arm, attached to the thing that was crouched just out of sight. Below the window line, he didn't want to see it. He couldn't bear to see it. He squeezed his eyes shut. It's not real. It's the wind, a branch. It's not real. The tapping stopped. Leo remained frozen, his eyes screwed shut. A full minute passed. He slowly, tentatively opened his eyes. The booth was silent. The gravel outside was empty. The world was still. Had it gone? His personal cell phone, tucked into a charger dock on the console, suddenly lit up. The screen, which had shown no service for the past 2 hours, now displayed an incoming call. His heart leaped into his throat. The caller ID in stark white letters read, "Mom." For a single glorious second, logic and reason ceased to exist. Leo saw the word "Mom" on his screen, and a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over him. The connection was back. He wasn't alone. He could call for help. He could hear his mother's voice. A lifeline to a world that made sense. A world where shadows were just shadows and tapping was just the wind. His hand shot out, snatching the phone from its cradle. His thumb stabbed at the green accept icon before his brain had a chance to catch up. "Mom." He choked out the word a desperate prayer. "Leo? Oh, thank God. Honey, are you okay?" It was her voice. It was undeniably, absolutely her voice. The same warm timbre, the same slight Pennsylvanian accent she never quite lost. The same undercurrent of worry that was present in nearly every conversation they'd ever had. Tears of relief pricked at Leo's eyes. "I'm okay, Mom, I'm okay. But something's happening out here. Something terrible. You have to call the police for me. The phones here aren't working. I know, honey, I know. Everything is down. It's the same here. A terrible storm." A storm? Leo glanced out the window. The sky above the reach of the floodlights was a placid, starry canvas. Not a cloud in sight. Small, cold seed of doubt was planted in the fertile soil of his panic. "There's no storm here, Mom," he said slowly. "It's coming your way, Leo. It's a bad one. That's why I was so worried." Her voice continued, smooth and reassuring. "Listen to me, honey. My car, it just broke down. The engine just died completely. I was so worried about you, I drove out to check on you." The seed of doubt began to sprout icy thorns. You drove out here? Mom, you're 3 states away. That's a 20-hour drive." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line, just a fraction of a second of dead air. When her voice returned, it held a new, slightly strained edge. "I know it was silly of me. I was just so worried. I'm right outside the gate to the station, Leo. It's so dark out here, and this storm. Can you just come open the main door for me? My key won't work in this rain." Leo's blood ran cold. He stared at the front door, visible on camera 1's grainy feed. The concrete stoop was empty. There was no car. There was no storm. There was no rain. They've learned the voices. The grotesque, whispered chorus of the broadcast filled his mind, and the illusion of his mother's voice shattered, revealing the horrifying mechanism beneath. It wasn't his mother. It was a recording. A performance, a lure, expertly crafted from his own memories and emotions, dangled in front of him like a fisherman's fly. "Where are you, Mom?" he asked, his own voice a dead, hollow whisper. He was playing along now, a fly testing the hook. "I told you, honey. Right outside. Please, Leo, I'm scared. It's so dark. Just open the door. I need you to open the door." The voice was becoming more insistent, the warmth curdling into a desperate, whining plea. Leo's gaze drifted from the camera feed back to the great window in front of him. The patient, rhythmic tapping had started again, in the exact same spot. Tap, tap, tap. The sound on the glass was perfectly in sync with the pauses in the voice on the phone. It was the same entity. One was the lure, the other was the trap. It was telling him where it was. I am here. Let me in. You're not my mother, Leo whispered into the phone, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. The voice on the other end stopped. The pleading, the false warmth, the worry, it all vanished. The silence that followed was heavy, ancient, and filled with a cold, alien intelligence. When the voice spoke again, it was no longer trying to imitate his mother. The mimicry was dissolving, the mask slipping to reveal the monster beneath. Open the door, Leo, it hissed, the voice stretching and distorting, the syllables pulling apart like hot taffy. The single voice fractured into a layered, chittering chorus, the same nauseating sound from the broadcast. It was the sound of 1,000 wet insects trying to say his name. With a cry of revulsion, Leo hurled the phone across the booth. It smashed against the concrete wall, the screen shattering, the battery flying out. The horrific voice was silenced, but the tapping on the window continued, faster now, more insistent. It was no longer a patient request. It was a demand. Tap, 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 tap. He was a rat in a glass cage, and the exterminator was at the door. The incessant tapping was a drill boring directly into Leo's sanity. It was the only sound in a world that had suddenly become too small, too quiet. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his eyes wide, fixed on the spot where the invisible assault was taking place. Tap, 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 tap. Faster, harder, a frantic, hungry rhythm. Whatever was out there was done playing games. The lure of his mother's voice had failed, and now the predator was resorting to brute force. He expected the glass to shatter, for a long, thin arm to snake through and unlock the door from the inside. He braced himself for the explosion of sound and the violation of his sanctuary. But the window, a thick, reinforced pane designed for mountain winters, held firm. The tapping stopped. The abrupt silence was somehow worse, pregnant with menace. Leo stood frozen in the middle of the booth, his ears ringing. What now? A low, guttural scraping sound began, moving from the window to the concrete wall of the station itself. It was the sound of something hard. Claws, perhaps, being dragged across the textured surface, testing for weakness. Leo could track its movement as the sound traveled along the front of the building, toward the main door. He scrambled for the camera monitor. He switched to camera 1. The concrete stoop was still empty, but he could see dust and small pebbles skittering away from the base of the door, as if disturbed by something just out of the camera's limited view. Then, the doorknob began to jiggle violently. The heavy steel door rattled in its frame. A deep percussive thump echoed through the station, followed by another. It was throwing itself against the door, a mindless brute force attack. Leo imagined the thing from his monitor, the tall, disjointed shadow, slamming its unnatural body against the reinforced steel. And then, everything went black. The lights, the monitors, the glowing console, the reassuring red "on air" sign. All of it died simultaneously. A profound, absolute darkness swallowed the booth. A darkness so complete, it felt like a physical substance. The only thing that remained was the violent, rhythmic slamming against the front door. Boom, boom, boom. For a horrifying second, Leo thought he was blind. He waved a hand in front of his face and felt nothing but empty air. Then, after a few eternal seconds, a single sputtering floodlight outside flickered back to life. It was immediately followed by the groan of a heavy engine kicking in from the back of the station. The emergency generator, dim. Orange emergency lights flickered on inside the booth, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with the unsteady rhythm of the generator. The main power was gone. He was on backup, a limited supply of diesel separating him from total darkness. The main console was dead, the broadcast signal cut off. The on-air light was dark. For the first time in hours, K-Wolf was silent. He was truly, finally, alone. The silence on the airwaves seemed to infuriate the things outside. The single rhythmic slamming on the door was joined by another, and then another. A cacophony of furious pounding erupted from all sides of the station at once. They were swarming the building, a pack of invisible wolves trying to break into the sheep pen. under the onslaught of the flickering emergency lights. The security monitor blinked back to life, the grainy images swimming in static. Leo's eyes shot to the screen, and he saw them. They had grown bold. They were no longer hiding at the edge of the light or below the camera angles. There were at least 3 of them. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to absorb the light, their forms indistinct and blurry, as if they were made of tightly packed static. They moved with the jerky, unnatural grace of a film reel running at the wrong speed. They had no discernible faces, just smooth, dark surfaces where a face should be. They hammered on the doors and walls with long, multi-jointed limbs that ended in points rather than hands. He was surrounded. The siege of K-Wolf had begun. He was trapped in a concrete box, a tin can, with a pack of faceless nightmares trying to peel it open. He looked around the dim, flickering booth. The window, the door, there was no escape. His sanctuary had become his tomb. The cacophony was a physical assault. The constant thunderous pounding on the walls and doors was more than just a sound. It was a vibration Leo could feel deep in his bones, in his teeth. It was the sound of his tomb being sealed. He had to move. He had to do something, staying in the fishbowl of the broadcast booth, with its massive, vulnerable window. Felt like suicide. With a surge of adrenaline, he scrambled out of the booth, his movements clumsy in the flickering orange emergency light. He slammed the heavy, soundproofed door of the booth behind him, the thick wood muffling the sounds of the siege to a dull, rhythmic thudding. It was a small mercy, but a welcome one. He was in the main corridor of the small station. To his right was the main entrance, the door still rattling violently in its frame. To his left, the hallway led to a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and at the very end, a storage closet that Arthur affectionately called the archives. It was where decades of old equipment, paperwork, and broadcast logs were left to gather dust. He had no plan, only a primal, driving need to put more walls between himself and the things outside. He ran down the short hallway, the generator's unsteady groan echoing in the confined space. He shouldered open the door to the archives and plunged inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The room was small, cramped, and smelled of dust, ozone, and decaying paper. Old reel-to-reel machines were stacked against one wall, their large platters like vacant, staring eyes. Cardboard boxes overflowed with vinyl records and promotional materials from a bygone era. On a metal shelf in the back corner sat a row of thick, leather-bound station logbooks, one for every year, since K-Wolf first went on the air in 1968. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. The old legends. If something like this had happened before, the only record of it would be in this room. He wedged a heavy, defunct amplifier under the doorknob, a flimsy barricade that offered more comfort than security. Then, using the weak beam from his phone's flashlight, he ran his fingers along the spines of the old logbooks. 2010, 1995, 1983. He pulled out a few from different decades, frantically flipping through the pages. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, equipment tests, notes on faulty vacuum tubes. He was about to give up, to dismiss the idea as a desperate fantasy, when a logbook from 1972 fell open in his hands. The handwriting was different from the others, a tight, spidery script that filled every inch of the page. The DJ's name was Alistair Finch. Leo remembered Arthur mentioning him once, the station's original and notoriously eccentric night shift host. He scanned the entries for the month of October. The first few weeks were normal. Then the tone began to change. October 21st, 1972. Strange interference on the signal tonight. Not the usual atmospheric crackle. This sounds organized, almost like whispers hiding beneath the music. Power flickered twice. Must be a problem with the line. October 24th, 1972. It happened again. The whispers, louder this time. Had a call from Old Man Hemlock out on Ridge Road. Swore he saw shadow men moving in the trees near the tower. Told him to lay off the moonshine. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He was reading a ghost story that had suddenly become his reality. He kept reading, his hands trembling so hard he could barely hold the phone steady. October 25th, 1972. They're not shadows. I saw one tonight. Just a glimpse at the edge of the light. Tall, wrong. It moved like a spider trying to walk like a man. The whispers on the air are constant now. I think I think they're drawn to the signal. Our voice is a light, and they are the moths. The last entry was dated October 27th, 1972. The handwriting was a frantic, barely legible scrawl, October 27th, 1972. They're at the door, tapping. Been doing it for hours. The signal is agitating them. I think I know why. They live in the noise, the static. Clean, strong broadcast signal like ours must be like a knife in their ears. It's pure, it's ordered, and they are chaos. They want to silence it, but I have an idea. An old engineer's failsafe, not to silence the signal, but to make it too pure. Overload the main transmitter. Create a feedback loop of absolute weaponized silence. A sonic blast on a frequency they can hear, but we can't. It could fry the whole system. It might even kill me. But it's the only way to... The entry ended there. The rest of the page was blank. Leo frantically flipped to the next page and the next. The logbook was empty. After that date, the handwriting changed completely. A new DJ taking over with a neat, simple entry. Alistair Finch has left the station. All clear. He hadn't just left. Leo knew it with a chilling certainty. Alistair had tried his desperate gambit. Had it worked? Had it killed him? Or had it failed, letting the tapping things inside? The thudding from the main hall suddenly stopped. The silence from outside was absolute. Leo held his breath, listening. The generator still groaned, but the assault was over. Had they given up, gone away? A new sound began. A slow, deliberate creak coming from the ceiling, directly above the archive room. It was the sound of a heavy weight being placed on the roof's maintenance hatch. The same hatch he'd seen on the station blueprints. They hadn't given up. They had just found a new way in. The creaking from the ceiling was the sound of a coffin lid being closed. Leo's blood ran cold. The archives, his temporary sanctuary, was about to become a trap. The maintenance hatch was his weakest point, a flimsy metal sheet separating him from the lanky, static nightmares on the roof. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. Alistair Finch's frantic scrawl burned in his mind. Overload the main transmitter, a feedback loop of absolute, weaponized silence. It was insane. A desperate Hail Mary pass from a ghost 50 years gone. It could destroy every piece of equipment in the station. It could start an electrical fire. Alistair himself seemed to think it could kill him. But the alternative was to stay here and wait for the hatch to buckle, for a long, pointed limb to descend from the darkness. There was no choice. Pushing the heavy amplifier away from the door, Leo took a deep, steadying breath and pulled it open. The main corridor was still bathed in the hellish orange glow of the emergency lights. The furious pounding on the walls had ceased, but the silence it left behind was filled with a new, more focused threat. All their attention was now on the roof above him. Creak. Serape. The sound of metal grinding on metal. They were prying at the edges of the hatch. He didn't have much time. He sprinted down the hallway, his worn boot slapping against the linoleum floor. The broadcast booth, his fishbowl, was no longer a place of vulnerability but his only hope. It was the cockpit, the command center, the one place where he could fight back. He burst into the booth and slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the lock. He felt a sliver of security return, but it was fleeting. The sounds from the roof were louder in here, echoing through the ventilation system. He stared at the main broadcast console. It was dark, inert, a dead thing. The main power was out. It was useless. But Alistair's plan, it centered on the transmitter, the massive piece of equipment that powered the entire station's broadcast, housed in a reinforced rack against the back wall of the booth. And it, like the lights, was wired into the emergency generator. He scrambled to the transmitter rack. It was a monolith of old and new technology, a stack of humming boxes and blinking lights. A small faded label, typed on a typewriter, was pasted near the main power conduit. Emergency frequency purge. Below it was a complex diagram of switches and dials. This had to be it, Alistair's failsafe. It was designed not just to be a panic button, but a sequence. A combination lock to prevent accidental activation. Groan. Bop! A sound like a gunshot echoed from the ceiling. One of the hatch's locks had broken. Leo's hands flew over the panel, his flashlight beam held between his teeth, dancing across the controls. His mind raced, deciphering the old schematic. It was a three-part sequence. First, reroute the generator's auxiliary power directly into the main capacitor. Second, disengage all audio inputs to create a pure null signal, the foundation for the silent broadcast. Third, override the safety modulators and push the amplification to maximum. It was, in essence, turning the entire broadcast system into a massive, highly specific stun gun, aimed at an enemy he couldn't see on a frequency he couldn't hear. He flipped the first switch. A deep, low hum began to build within the rack, a sound he could feel in the soles of his feet. The lights in the booth dimmed as the generator diverted power. Crack. Another lock on the hatch gave way. He could hear them now, not just their scraping, but their vocalizations. A low, chittering static, like 1,000 tiny mouths chewing on electricity. He turned the dial to disengage the audio inputs. The hum from the transmitter deepened, rising in pitch. The air in the small booth grew thick, charged with ozone. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He felt a pressure building in his ears, a silent scream just beyond the range of his hearing. He reached for the final control, a large, red, spring-loaded safety switch that would initiate the final overload. His fingers hovered over it. This was the point of no return, Alistair's final desperate act. A loud metallic shriek tore through the air as the maintenance hatch was ripped from its hinges. The chittering static grew deafening, pouring down from the ceiling into the main hallway. They were in. The sound of the creatures flooding into the station was a nightmare symphony. The chittering static filled the hallway, a sound that felt alive, crawling, and utterly alien. It was accompanied by the sharp, skittering clicks of their pointed limbs on the linoleum floor, and a series of wet, tearing noises as they began to mindlessly rip apart the kitchenette and office. They were a tide of pure chaos, and the locked door to the broadcast booth was the last breakwater, holding them back. Leo's entire world had shrunk to the humming transmitter rack and the large, red switch under his trembling fingers. The pressure in his ears was immense, a physical pain that made his vision swim. The air was so thick with ozone it burned his lungs. The low hum had escalated into a high-pitched keening whine, the sound of a machine being pushed far beyond its limits, screaming in protest. Boom! The first impact rocked the booth door. It was heavier, sharper than the mindless slamming from before. They knew he was in here. They knew this room was the source of the pressure, the pure signal that was causing them such distress. Leo kept his hand on the red switch, his knuckles white. The schematic wasn't just a switch. It was a process. The capacitor needed time to charge. A small analog needle on the panel, barely visible in the flickering light, was slowly creeping into a red zone marked Danger, Peak Capacity. It was only halfway there. He needed more time. Boom! Crack! A deep fissure splintered across the top of the wooden door. A long, razor-thin black limb, impossibly fast, stabbed through the new opening, thrashing blindly in the air. It was like the leg of a great dark insect, glistening and sharp. Leo scrambled backward, a strangled cry catching in his throat. The limb retracted and the assault on the door began in earnest. It was no longer a disorganized frenzy, but a focused, intelligent attack on the crack, widening it with every hellish impact. Leo's eyes darted between the splintering door and the agonizingly slow needle on the capacitor gauge. 3/4 of the way there. Not enough. He glanced at the massive window. For the first time, he wished it was just a solid wall of concrete. It was his largest, most indefensible position. He prayed they would remain focused on the door, that they wouldn't realize the glass was a far easier target. As if summoned by his fear, a new sound began. The rhythmic, maddening tap-tap-tapping started again on the glass, but it wasn't a gentle exploratory sound this time. It was a sharp, percussive cracking, the sound of a chisel striking stone. He turned his head. A figure stood on the other side of the glass, its form wavering in the unsteady generator light. A tall, static-wrought shadow with a face of pure, featureless dark. It raised one of its long, pointed limbs and brought it down again. Crack. A spiderweb of fractures erupted on the thick glass, centered on the point of impact. The soundproof window, his shield against the world, was failing. The needle on the gauge finally touched the red line. Peak capacity. It was now or never. The creature outside the window raised its arm for another strike. Through the splintering hole in the door, Leo could see at least 2 more of the things rushing down the hallway towards him. He slammed his palm down on the big red switch. There was no immediate sound. No explosion. For a heartbeat, Leo thought it had failed. Then, the world dissolved. It was a roar that he felt in his atoms, a wave of pure pressure that had no audible component, but was louder than anything he had ever experienced. The lights in the booth didn't just flicker. They exploded in a shower of sparks. The transmitter rack let out a final metallic shriek and went dark. The very air vibrated, becoming a solid, immovable object, a silent, deafening wave of pure. Weaponized order erupted from the K-Wolf Tower, a perfect, clean frequency designed to annihilate chaos. Through the fracturing window, Leo saw the creature recoil, as if it had been physically struck. Its form, once a solid shape of packed static, began to unravel. The darkness of its face dissolved, revealing a maelstrom of screeching, frantic energy within. A mouth that wasn't a mouth opened, letting out a silent, agonized scream. The chittering in the hallway was replaced by the same silent, high-frequency shrieking. The creatures writhed, their bodies dissolving, their forms breaking apart like smoke in a hurricane. They weren't just being repelled, they were being unmade, their chaotic energy forcibly smoothed into nothingness by the pure, unrelenting wave of the signal. The last thing Leo saw before he blacked out was the creature at the window disintegrating, its final hateful gaze fixed on him as it dissolved back into the static from which it was born. Leo awoke to a world of absolute silence. Not the comfortable, controlled silence of his broadcast booth between songs, but a deep, ringing void that felt deafening. He was slumped on the floor, his back against the cool metal of the dead transmitter rack. His head throbbed with a dull, concussive ache, and the air tasted of burnt plastic and ozone. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply lay there, taking inventory. He was alive. His limbs worked. The terrifying, silent scream that had overwhelmed his senses was gone, leaving only a profound, echoing emptiness. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself into a sitting position. The booth was a wreck. The emergency lights were dead, the main lights shattered. The only illumination came from a weak gray light filtering through the massive, fractured window. Dawn. The long night was over. He looked at the window. The spiderweb of cracks covered nearly its entire surface, a fragile monument to the night's horrors. Outside, the world was being reborn in shades of gray and soft pink. The gravel driveway was empty. The silent, stoic pines stood sentinel at the edge of the woods, looking exactly as they always had. There was no sign of the creatures, no physical evidence they had ever been there at all, save for the damage they had wrought. He staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady, and looked at the booth's door. It was a ruin. Hanging from a single hinge, the wood around the lock splintered into 1,000 pieces. The long, thin gash from the creature's limb was a dark, ugly scar. Hesitantly, he stepped out into the main corridor. The destruction was chaotic and meaningless. Ceiling panels were torn down, wires dangling like entrails. The kitchenette was a disaster zone, with the refrigerator door ripped from its hinges and its contents strewn across the floor. It was a mindless, destructive rage, the tantrum of a thwarted predator. He walked to the main entrance and peered through the security peephole in the battered steel door. The world outside was calm, peaceful, and bathed in the gentle light of the rising sun. A layer of morning mist clung to the ground, softening the edges of the trees. It was a picture of profound serenity, a world utterly at odds with the violence of the preceding hours. There was no body of a dog named Buster. There was no wrecked car belonging to a frantic mother. There was just the woods, the gravel, and the silence. It was as if the entire night had been a terrible waking nightmare. But the broken door, the shattered window, and the dead silence of his equipment were undeniable proof. Alistair Finch's gambit had worked. The weaponized silence had scoured them away, unmaking them, returning them to whatever void they had crawled out of. He was safe. He had survived. He stumbled back to the broadcast booth, the adrenaline that had kept him going for hours finally draining away, leaving a heavy, leaden exhaustion in its place. He collapsed into his worn leather chair, the familiar seat a small comfort in the midst of the wreckage. He stared out the broken window at the rising sun. He had won. He had faced the monsters in the dark and banished them. But as the sun climbed higher, casting its warm golden light across the ravaged station, He felt no sense of victory, only a hollow, aching emptiness. He had spent the night broadcasting silence as a weapon. Now, with his station destroyed and the airwaves dead, that silence was all he had left. Weeks bled into months. The official story, concocted by a bewildered Arthur and a tight-lipped station owner, was that a rare meteorological event, a so-called dry lightning strike, had hit the K-Wolf transmitter. It had caused a massive electrical surge that fried the station's systems and induced a severe stress-related psychotic episode in the lone overnight DJ. Leo didn't bother to correct them. How could he? Who would believe the truth? He took the generous severance package, packed a single suitcase, and left Pine Creek without looking back. His car was the only thing that had survived the night untouched. A small, overlooked island of normality in a sea of chaos. He moved to a city, a sprawling metropolis hundreds of miles away, trading the profound silence of the mountains for the constant, anonymous roar of urban life. He found a small apartment on the 7th floor of a concrete tower, a place where the sounds of traffic, sirens, and neighbors arguing through thin walls were a constant, comforting blanket of noise. Silence was a luxury he could no longer afford. Silence was where they waited. He got a menial job stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store. The overnight shift, a cruel irony he couldn't escape. But here, under the harsh, unwavering fluorescent lights, surrounded by the quiet shuffling of other night owls, he felt a measure of safety. There were no deep shadows here, no oppressive darkness pressing against a window. But he was not the same. He was a man forever changed, a radio receiver permanently damaged by a single horrific broadcast. He was tuned to a new frequency now, and he couldn't turn it off. It started subtly, a flicker in the corner of his eye while watching television, a momentary distortion in the screen's reflection that looked unnervingly like a long, stretched limb. He would rewind the show, but it would never be there. He would hear it in the hum of his old refrigerator, a low, guttural whisper hiding just beneath the drone of the compressor. Leo, ayo. He would rip the plug from the wall and the whisper would vanish, leaving him standing in the sudden, terrifying silence of his kitchen. The worst was the static. The snow on an untuned television channel was a canvas for their faces, smooth and dark and featureless. The hiss between radio stations was no longer just noise. It was their language, a chorus of chittering whispers that seemed to be searching, hunting for a signal to lock onto. He threw his television and radio away. He avoided looking at his own reflection in dark windows at night. He saw the way they moved in the wavering images, a twitchy, disjointed gait that was not his own. He was haunted. He had survived the siege of K-Wolf, but the victory was a hollow one. Alistair Finch's weapon hadn't just banished them. It had opened a door in Leo's own mind. The broadcast hadn't just been a warning to the world. It had been an attunement. He was the only one who had truly listened, and now he couldn't stop. One night, while walking home from his shift just before dawn, he passed an electronics store. A wall of brand-new, high-definition televisions was on display, all tuned to a 24-hour news channel. As he walked by, every single screen in perfect unison dissolved into a field of black and white static. Leo froze on the empty sidewalk. He stared at the wall of roiling, chaotic noise, and from the center of every screen, a single, dark, faceless shape began to resolve. Its form blurry and indistinct. It was tall. It was thin. It was looking right at him. They hadn't been destroyed. They had been scattered, and now, piece by piece, whisper by whisper, they were finding their way back through the noise. They remembered his name. They remembered his face. And they had all the time in the world. The broadcast was over, but for Leo, the echoes in the static would never, ever end.